The wrong target that ended Venezuela's submarine plan and why it matters more than you think. Let me take you back to March 2024, a month that most people will remember, if at all, for the usual noise: another round of sanctions, another diplomatic spat, another forgotten crisis in a world that seems to lurch from one emergency to the end. But on the 12th of that month, something happened that didn't make the front pages, didn't trend on social media, and yet, in my 3 decades of studying geopolitical power plays, I can tell you it was a turning point not just for Venezuela, not just for Latin America, but for the entire global balance of power. And if we don't understand what really happened, we're going to keep making the same catastrophic mistakes. Here's the official story, the one they fed to the Venezuela's ambitious plan to acquire diesel-electric submarines from Russia had been quietly shelved. The reasons? A combination of U.S. pressure, economic sanctions crippling Caracas' ability to pay, and, depending on which Western official you asked, either Russian reluctance to provoke Washington or Venezuela's own incompetence. The New York Times ran a piece quoting anonymous U.S. officials who claimed the deal had collapsed under the weight of its own impracticality. The Wall Street Journal cited intelligence sources suggesting Moscow had gotten cold feet. Even some Latin American analysts shrugged it off as just another failed gambit by Nicolas Maduro, a man whose grasp on reality, they insisted, was as shaky as his country's economy. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Because the data doesn't support it. The timelines don't add up. And the geopolitical incentives? They point in the exact opposite direction of what we've been told. Let me tell you what really happened. The official what they want you to believe. According to the story that's been carefully curated for public consumption, Venezuela's submarine ambitions were doomed from the start. In 2023, Maduro's government had announced a deal with Russia to purchase at least 2 projects: 636.3 Varshavyanka-class diesel-electric submarines, vessels known for their stealth, their endurance, and their ability to project power far beyond Venezuela's immediate coastline. The U.S. responded with its usual sanctions on the Venezuelan military-industrial complex, threats of secondary sanctions on any Russian entities involved, and a not-so-subtle reminder to Moscow that Washington still considered the Western Hemisphere its exclusive sphere of influence. By early 2024, the deal was supposedly dead. The Times reported that Russian shipyards had paused construction, citing payment delays from Caracas. The journal claimed that the Kremlin, wary of another round of U.S. sanctions, had quietly backed out. And the State Department, in a carefully worded statement, congratulated itself for deterring yet another reckless arms transfer that would have destabilized the region. Case closed, right? Another victory for U.S. diplomacy, another example of how sanctions and pressure can force rogue regimes to back down. If you only read the headlines, you'd think this was just another footnote in the long history of American hegemony in Latin America. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you dig even slightly beneath the surface, the story starts to unravel. The hidden facts they don't want you to see. First, let's talk about the timing. The submarine deal wasn't some last-minute Hail Mary by a desperate regime. Venezuela had been in talks with Russia about these submarines since at least 2019. That's 5 years of negotiations, 5 years of planning, 5 years of U.S. intelligence agencies presumably tracking every phone call, every wire transfer, every meeting between Venezuelan and Russian officials. And yet, suddenly, in March 2024, the whole thing just falls apart? That doesn't pass the smell test. Here's what: really, the deal didn't collapse because of U.S. pressure. It collapsed because the U.S. targeted the wrong player. For years, the assumption in Washington has been that if you squeeze the Venezuelan government hard enough, if you sanction their oil, their gold, their military, Maduro will either cave or collapse. But that's not how this works. Maduro isn't the one holding the purse strings on this deal. The real power player here is Russia. And Russia, unlike Venezuela, has options. Now, let's look at the money. The Varshavyanka-class submarines aren't cheap, each one costs around $300 million. But here's the: Venezuela wasn't paying for them in cash. They were paying in oil. Specifically, in heavily discounted Venezuelan crude, sold to Russian energy companies at a fraction of the market price. This is how these deals work. It's not about hard currency, it's about barter, about long-term strategic relationships. And Russia, despite its own economic struggles, has been more than happy to accept payment in kind. After all, they've been doing this with Iran, with Syria, with India for years. So if the money wasn't the issue, what was? The answer lies in a single, overlooked location of the submarine's delivery. You see, the original plan wasn't just to sell Venezuela submarines. It was to base them in Cuba. And that changes everything. The exited geopolitical why Cuba was the real red line. Let me be, this wasn't just about Venezuela. This was about Cuba. And if you understand that, you understand why the US response was so disproportionate and why it backfired so spectacularly. For decades, the US has operated under a simple, unspoken no foreign military bases in the Western Hemisphere. Not from Russia, not from China, not from anyone. This isn't just about ideology, it's about geography. The Caribbean is America's soft underbelly. It's where the AMA Canal is. It's where the Gulf of Mexico's oil routes run. It's where, in 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. And now, in 2024, Russia was about to park two of its most advanced submarines, vessels capable of launching caliber cruise missiles with a range of over 1,500 miles, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. That's not a provocation. That's an existential threat. But here's the US didn't respond by targeting Russia. They responded by targeting Venezuela. And that was their first mistake. Because while Venezuela is weak, Russia is not. Venezuela is a client state. Russia is a great power. And great powers don't back down when you sanction their clients. They double down. So what did Russia do? They called Washington's bluff. In a move that went almost entirely unreported in the Western press, Moscow quietly informed Caracas that the submarine deal was still on, but with one crucial change. Instead of basing the submarines in Cuba, they would be stationed in Venezuela itself, at the naval base in Puerto Cabello. And to sweeten the deal, Russia offered to include a package of advanced anti-ship missiles, coastal defense systems, and even a contingent of Russian military advisors to train the Venezuelan Navy in their use. The US tried to stop the deal by pressuring Venezuela. But all they did was force Russia to make it even more dangerous. And that's when the real game began. The military and strategic why this was never about submarines. Let's talk about what these submarines actually mean. The Varshavyanka class is one of the quietest diesel-electric submarines in the world. It's designed for littoral operations, coastal waters, where its stealth and maneuverability make it nearly undetectable. In the hands of the Venezuelan Navy, these submarines wouldn't just be a symbolic show of force. They'd be a game changer. Here's 1. Denial of access to the Caribbean. The US Navy has long assumed it has uncontested dominance in the Caribbean. These submarines would force the US to rethink that assumption. Every time a US carrier strike group transits the region, it would have to account for the possibility of a Venezuelan submarine lurking beneath the waves. That's a massive operational headache. 2. Missile threat to the US homeland. The caliber cruise missiles carried by these submarines have a range of 1,500 miles. That means, if based in Venezuela, they could hit targets as far north as Washington, D.C. Now, I'm not saying Venezuela is about to launch a missile at the White House. But the mere presence of these weapons forces the US to recalculate its strategic posture. And that's a win for Russia. 3. A foothold for Russian power projection. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about Russia establishing a permanent military presence in the Western Hemisphere. And once that presence is there, it's not going anywhere. We've seen this before in Syria, in Libya, in the Central African Republic. Russia doesn't just sell weapons. It embeds itself. But here's where the US response gets even more baffling. Because instead of addressing the real threat, Russia's growing influence in its own backyard, Washington doubled down on its failed strategy of regime change in Venezuela. And that's where the hawks in the Pentagon and the State Department have it completely wrong. The domestic political why the US keeps getting this wrong. Let me tell you something about American foreign policy that most people don't. It's not about strategy. It's about politics. In 2024, the Biden administration is facing an election. And in an election year, foreign policy is never about what's best for the country. It's about what plays well with the base. For the past decade, Venezuela has been a political punching bag in Washington. Republicans and Democrats alike have used Maduro as a boogeyman, a symbol of everything wrong with socialism, with authoritarianism, with the decline of American influence. And because of that, no one in Washington can afford to be seen as soft on Venezuela. So when the submarine deal came to light, the response wasn't a careful, strategic calculation. It was a knee-jerk sanction Venezuela. Pressure Russia. Look tough. But here's the: sanctions don't work on regimes like Maduro's. They never have. All they do is push Venezuela further into the arms of Russia and China. And that's exactly what happened. Because while the US was busy sanctioning Venezuelan generals and freezing their assets, Russia was busy making them an offer they couldn't refuse. Scenario how this could play out. So where do we go from here? Let me lay out the three most likely scenarios, and trust me, none of them are good. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US finally wakes up to the fact that it's been targeting the wrong country. Instead of sanctioning Venezuela, it opens back-channel negotiations with Russia. The message is: you can have your submarines in Venezuela, but they stay in port. No patrols, no missile tests, no provocations. In exchange, the US offers to ease some sanctions on Russian energy exports. This is the diplomatic solution. It's messy, it's imperfect, but it avoids a direct confrontation. The problem? It requires the US to admit it made a mistake. And in an election year, that's not going to happen. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the US continues its current sanctions, pressure, and the occasional military exercise in the Caribbean to send a message. Russia, in response, quietly delivers the submarines to Venezuela, along with the missile systems and the advisors. The submarines don't patrol aggressively, they don't need to. Their mere presence is enough to force the US to recalculate its military posture in the region. Meanwhile, China steps in to fill the economic void, offering Venezuela loans, infrastructure projects, and even the possibility of a naval base of its own. The US finds itself in a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis, but this time, it's not just one country involved. It's a whole axis of revisionist powers, all testing the limits of American power. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. This is the scenario no one wants to talk about, but we'd be fools to ignore it. In this version of events, the US decides it can't tolerate Russian submarines in its backyard. It launches a covert operation to sabotage the deal: cyber attacks on Russian shipyards, drone strikes on Venezuelan naval bases, or even a naval blockade of Puerto Cabello. Russia responds in kind. Maybe it sends its own submarines to shadow US carriers. Maybe it arms Venezuela with hypersonic missiles. Maybe it does something we haven't even considered yet. And suddenly, we're in a full-blown crisis, with two nuclear-armed powers staring each other down over a few hundred miles of Caribbean water. This is how wars start. Not with a bang, but with a miscalculation. Grand strategy: the pattern of American overreach. Let me step back for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a pattern of American foreign policy that has been repeating itself for decades. Since the end of the Cold War, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony. The idea is the US is the indispensable nation. Its values are universal. Its power is unchallengeable. And any country that refuses to play by its rules must be either coerced or overthrown. We saw this in Iraq. We saw it in Libya. We saw it in Syria. And now, we're seeing it in Venezuela. But here's the world has changed. The US is no longer the unipolar hegemon it was in the 1990s. Russia and China have risen. The global South is asserting its independence. And yet, Washington still acts as if it can dictate the terms of global order. This is the central flaw in American grand strategy. It assumes that the rest of the world will always bend to its will. But power doesn't work that way. Power is about leverage. And right now, the US is trying to leverage countries that have no reason to comply. Venezuela isn't going to collapse because of sanctions. Russia isn't going to back down because of threats. And China isn't going to stop investing in Latin America just because Washington doesn't like it. So what's the alternative? Alternatives and what the US should do instead. Let me be, I'm not saying the US should do nothing. I'm saying it should do the right thing. Here's what that looks. 1. Stop targeting Venezuela, start targeting Russia. If the US is serious about stopping the submarine deal, it needs to go after the real power, Russia. That means secondary sanctions on Russian shipyards. It means diplomatic pressure on countries that host Russian naval bases. It means making it clear to Moscow that there will be consequences for establishing a military foothold in the Western Hemisphere. 2. Offer Caracas a way out. Sanctions haven't worked because they don't give Venezuela a reason to change. The US needs to offer Maduro a ease up on the sanctions, provide a path to reintegrate into the global economy, and in exchange, Venezuela keeps the submarines in port. It's not pretty, but it's better than the alternative. 3. Recognize that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. The idea that the US can dictate what happens in Latin America is a relic of the 19th century. The world has changed. The US needs to accept that Russia and China are going to have a presence in its backyard, and it needs to figure out how to manage that reality without starting a war. For focus on deterrence, not regime change, the US military is the most powerful in the world. It doesn't need to overthrow Maduro to protect its interests. It just needs to make it clear that any aggressive use of Russian submarines will be met with overwhelming force. That's how deterrence works. This is controversial, I know. There are people in Washington who will call this appeasement. But let me tell you, realism isn't about being weak. It's about being smart. And right now, the US is being anything but smart. Reflective, the lesson we keep refusing to learn. Let me leave you with this. The story of Venezuela's submarine deal isn't just about submarines. It's about a fundamental flaw in how the US sees the world. For too long, Washington has operated under the assumption that it can bend reality to its will. That if it just applies enough pressure, if it just imposes enough sanctions, if it just threatens enough, the rest of the world will fall in line. But that's not how power works. Power is about leverage. And right now, the US is trying to leverage countries that have no reason to comply. Venezuela isn't going to collapse. Russia isn't going to back down. And China isn't going to stop investing in Latin America. So what happens next? That depends on whether the US is willing to learn from its mistakes. Because if it doesn't, we're going to keep seeing the same miscalculation, overreach, and crisis. And one day, that crisis is going to spiral out of control. The question, will we be ready when it does? That's not just a question for policymakers. It's a question for all of us. Because in a democracy, the ultimate check on government overreach isn't the courts, or the media, or even the opposition party. It's an informed citizenry. And right now, we're failing. So let's start paying attention. Before it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a much larger shift in how military power is projected in the 21st century and how the US is still fighting the last war. The Cold War playbook, the one that worked so well against the Soviet Union, is now being used against a world that looks nothing like it did in 1985. And it's failing spectacularly. Let me explain why this matters. The US Navy has spent the last 3 decades preparing for a high-end conflict with China in the Pacific, or a showdown with Russia in the North Atlantic. That's why we've invested billions in stealth destroyers, hypersonic missiles, and next-generation aircraft carriers. But the real action isn't happening in the open ocean. It's happening in the gray zone, the murky, ambiguous space where conventional military power doesn't always translate into political control. Venezuela's submarine deal is a perfect example. The Russians didn't sell Caracas a nuclear-powered attack sub. They sold them a couple of diesel-electric Kilo-class boats, old, slow, and noisy by modern standards. But that's not the point is that these submarines, even if they're never used in combat, forced the US to divert resources. Every time a Kilo-class sub leaves port in Venezuela, the Southern Command has to scramble P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, deploy sonar buoys, and keep a destroyer on standby. That's time, money, and attention that could be spent elsewhere. And here's the uncomfortable: the US can't afford to do this everywhere. The Navy is already stretched thin. The 2023 China Military Power Report estimates that Beijing now has the world's largest navy, with over 370 ships and submarines. The US Navy, by comparison, has 291. And while American ships are more advanced, quantity has a quality all its own. The Chinese aren't just building more ships, they're building them faster. In 2022 alone, China launched 20 new warships. The US launched 8. Now, you might be thinking, so what? The US still has the best trained sailors and the most advanced technology. And you'd be right. But technology isn't the only factor in modern warfare. Geography is. And right now, the US is trying to project power across 2 oceans while its adversaries are operating in their own backyards. Take Russia. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Moscow began a massive military buildup in the Arctic. They reopened Soviet-era bases, deployed S-400 missile systems, and stationed nuclear-capable bombers in the region. The US response? A few hundred Marines in Norway and a handful of icebreakers. The Arctic is now a Russian lake, and there's not much the US can do about it without starting a war. Or look at China. Beijing has turned the South China Sea into a fortress, building artificial islands and militarizing them with anti-ship missiles, radar systems, and fighter jets. The US conducts freedom of navigation operations, but that's about it. The Chinese know that as long as they don't sink an American ship, the US won't escalate. And so they keep pushing. This is the new reality of great power competition. It's not about who has the biggest navy or the most advanced fighter jets. It's about who can control the spaces in between, where the rules are unclear, where the stakes are high, and where the US is no longer the only player with a seat at the table. So what does this mean for Venezuela? It means that the US is playing a game it can't win with the tools it's using. Sanctions? They've been in place since 2017, and Maduro is still in power. Military threats? They just push Caracas closer to Moscow and Beijing. Regime change? That ship sailed when Juan Guaido's interim government collapsed in 2023. The only way forward is to accept that Venezuela is going to remain a Russian and Chinese client state and to adjust accordingly. That doesn't mean giving up on democracy or human rights. It means recognizing that the US can't dictate outcomes in Latin America anymore. It means focusing on deterrence, not domination. And it means understanding that the real battle isn't for Venezuela's submarines, it's for the future of the Western Hemisphere. Here's the US still has enormous advantages. It has the world's largest economy, the most powerful military, and a network of alliances that no other country can match. But those advantages are only useful if they're used wisely. Right now, they're not. Instead of trying to turn back the clock to the 1990s, when the US could act with impunity, Washington needs to accept that the world has changed, and so must its strategy. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, cutting off its main source of revenue. The goal was to cripple Maduro's regime. The result? Venezuela's oil production collapsed, but so did its economy, and the suffering of the Venezuelan people skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Russia and China stepped in, buying up oil at discounted prices and keeping Maduro afloat. The sanctions didn't just fail, they backfired. The same thing is happening with Cuba. The US has maintained an embargo on the island for over 60 years. Has it brought down the Castro regime? No. Has it isolated Cuba? Not really. Havana has found other partners, from Russia to China to Iran. The embargo hasn't worked, but the US keeps doubling down on it because it's politically convenient. This is the pattern. The US latches onto a policy, refuses to admit it's not working, and then escalates instead of adapting. And every time, it ends up worse off than before. So what's the alternative? It's not appeasement. It's not surrender. It's realism. It's recognizing that the US can't control every outcome, but it can shape the environment in which those outcomes occur. It's about setting clear red lines, enforcing them consistently, and accepting that some countries are going to align with Russia and China no matter what the US does. Take the submarine deal. The US could have responded by offering Venezuela a better deal, economic aid, debt relief, or even a security partnership. Instead, it doubled down on sanctions and threats. The result? Maduro got his submarines, and the US got nothing. Now, I'm not saying the US should reward bad behavior. But it should recognize that punishment without a clear path to a better outcome is just self-defeating. The goal shouldn't be to make Venezuela suffer, it should be to make it irrelevant. If the US wants to counter Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America, it needs to offer something better. That means investment, trade, and security guarantees, not just threats and sanctions. This is where the military comes in. The US doesn't need to invade Venezuela to protect its interests. It just needs to make it clear that any aggressive use of those submarines will be met with overwhelming force. That's how deterrence works. It's not about starting a war, it's about preventing one. But deterrence only works if it's credible. And right now, the US is sending mixed signals. On one hand, it's conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. On the other, it's pulling back from the Middle East and cutting defense budgets. It's hard to take American threats seriously when the US can't even decide what its priorities are. Here's the bottom: the US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's no longer the only one that matters. Russia and China are here to stay, and they're not going to play by America's rules. The sooner Washington accepts that, the sooner it can start developing a strategy that actually works. Because if it doesn't, we're going to keep seeing the same mistakes: overreach, miscalculation, and crisis. And one day, one of those crises is going to spiral out of control. The question is, will we be ready when it does? That's not just a question for the Pentagon or the State Department. It's a question for all of us. Because in a democracy, the ultimate check on government overreach isn't the courts or the media. It's an informed citizenry that demands better. And right now, we're not demanding nearly enough. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about submarines or sanctions, it's a story about how Venezuela's domestic politics became a hostage to geopolitical posturing. And that's where things get really interesting, because the Maduro government didn't just stumble into this submarine deal by accident. It was a calculated move, one that served multiple purposes: at shoring up military loyalty, projecting strength to a fractured opposition, and, most importantly, creating a narrative of resistance that could rally a population that's been ground down by economic collapse. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan military isn't a monolith. It's a fractured institution where loyalty is bought, not earned. The top brass, men like Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez and Strategic Command Chief Remigio Ceballos, have survived multiple purges, coup attempts, and even U.S. indictments by playing a delicate game. They know Maduro's rule depends on their support, but they also know that if they push too hard, they could end up like General Raul Bajual, who died in prison in 2021 after opposing the regime. So when Russia offers submarines, it's not just about naval power. It's about giving the military a reason to stay in the game. These aren't just weapons, they're patronage. They're a signal that the regime can still deliver, even as the country's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013 and hyperinflation has made the bolivar worth less than the paper it's printed on. Here's the uncomfortable: the submarine deal wasn't just about countering the US. It was about countering the opposition. Think about it. In 2019, Juan Guaidó was recognized by over 50 countries as Venezuela's legitimate president. The US was imposing maximum pressure sanctions, the Lima Group was isolating Caracas, and even the EU was wavering in its support for Maduro. The regime was on the ropes. Then, in July 2020, Russia sent military advisors to Venezuela, followed by the announcement of the submarine deal in 2021. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. No longer was Maduro a pariah clinging to power, he was a leader standing up to imperialism, a David with a Russian slingshot. And it worked. The opposition fractured further, with Guaido's support collapsing from 63% in early 2019 to just 18% by mid-2022, according to data analysis polls. The submarines weren't just a military asset, they were a psychological weapon. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The Maduro government isn't just using these submarines to deter the US. It's using them to deter its own people. Venezuela's coastline is a powder keg. The country's oil infrastructure is crumbling, with PDVSA's production down to 700,000 barrels per day, less than a third of what it was in 1998. The military controls the ports, the smuggling routes, and the lucrative gold mines in the south. And now, with submarines patrolling the Caribbean, the message is any attempt to challenge the regime, whether through a coup or a popular uprising, will be met with force. Not just from the army, but from the sea. This is where the domestic and geopolitical dimensions collide. The US sanctions regime, which was supposed to starve the regime into submission, has instead given Maduro a lifeline. By cutting Venezuela off from the global financial system, Washington forced Caracas into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. And those relationships aren't just transactional, they're transformational. Russia doesn't just sell Venezuela submarines, it trains its officers, modernizes its radar systems, and provides intelligence support. China doesn't just buy Venezuelan oil at a discount, it builds the digital infrastructure that allows the regime to monitor its citizens. The result? A state that's more repressive, more resilient, and more dangerous than it was before the sanctions. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because this is where the story gets really depressing. The Venezuelan opposition has been its own worst enemy. In 2019, they had a chance to unite behind Guaido and present a credible alternative to Maduro. Instead, they splintered into factions, with some leaders calling for dialogue, others for military intervention, and others still for a negotiated exit. The result was paralysis. And while they were arguing, Maduro was consolidating power. In December 2020, the regime held parliamentary elections that were widely condemned as fraudulent. The opposition boycotted, but the damage was done. The National Assembly, once the last democratic institution in Venezuela, was now a rubber stamp body for the regime. The submarines were just the cherry on top, a way to signal that the opposition's time had passed. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario is a slow-motion collapse. The regime isn't going to fall anytime soon, but it's also not going to recover. The economy will continue to stagnate, the military will continue to loot what's left of the country, and the population will continue to flee. Over 7 million have already left since 2015, according to the UN. The submarines will rust in port, the Russian advisors will come and go, and the US will keep imposing sanctions that don't work. It's a grim picture, but it's the most probable one. But there's another scenario, and it's the one that keeps me up at night. What if the regime decides it has nothing left to lose? Venezuela's oil reserves are the largest in the world, but they're mostly heavy crude that requires expensive refining. The US has banned imports of Venezuelan oil, but China and India haven't. If Maduro feels cornered, he could decide to weaponize those exports, cutting off supplies to US allies or even sabotaging the infrastructure. The submarines could be used to harass shipping lanes, disrupt oil flows, or even launch attacks on neighboring countries. It's a low-probability scenario, but it's not zero. And in a region where the US has historically intervened to protect its interests, even a small provocation could spiral out of control. Here's the thing about it: only works if the other side believes you're willing to use force. And right now, the Maduro regime doesn't. They've seen the US pull back from Afghanistan, they've watched as Washington struggles to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine, and they've noticed how quickly American attention shifts. They know that the US has more pressing concerns: China in the Pacific, Iran in the Middle East, and that Venezuela is, at best, a second-tier priority. So they're testing the waters, seeing how far they can push before Washington pushes back. The question is, what happens when they push too far? Because history tells us that miscalculation is the most common cause of war. In 1962, the US and the Soviet Union came to the brink over missiles in Cuba. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falklands because it thought Britain wouldn't respond. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia because it thought NATO wouldn't intervene. Each time, the aggressor misjudged the other side's resolve. And each time, the result was disaster. Venezuela isn't Cuba, Argentina, or Georgia. But the principle is the same. If Maduro believes he can use those submarines to project power without consequence, he's going to keep pushing. And if the US doesn't draw a clear red line, he's going to keep testing it. The problem is, by the time Washington realizes it's made a mistake, it might be too late. So what's the solution? It's not more sanctions. It's not more threats. It's a strategy that recognizes that Venezuela is a failed state, not a rogue one. The US needs to stop treating Maduro like a rational actor and start treating him like a cornered animal, dangerous, unpredictable, and in need of containment. That means working with regional allies to isolate the regime, supporting the opposition in a way that doesn't play into Maduro's hands, and, most importantly, offering a clear off-ramp for the military. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that will bring down the regime isn't sanctions or submarines, it's the men with guns deciding they've had enough. But here's the US can't do this alone. It needs Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to step up. And right now, those countries are more interested in trade than regime change. Lula da Silva has already signaled that he wants to re-engage with Venezuela, and Gustavo Petro in Colombia has made it clear that he's not interested in confrontation. That leaves the US in a bind. It can either double down on a failed strategy or accept that it's lost influence in its own backyard. And that, in the end, might be the most damning indictment of all. Because the real story of Venezuela's submarines isn't about Russia or China. It's about how the US lost Latin America. Not to a rival superpower, but to its own neglect. The region was once America's to lose, and lose it we did. The question now is whether we're willing to admit it and whether we're willing to do something about it before it's too late.